I spent 31 years making decisions that changed people's lives. I sat behind a bench, listened to arguments, and wrote opinions that sometimes made the front page of newspapers. And somehow, after all of that, the hardest thing I ever had to do was sit quietly at a dinner table and pretend I was nobody. I almost didn't. There were at least 4 moments that evening where I nearly opened my mouth. But I didn't, and I'm so glad I waited. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I am 67 years old, I live alone in the house I shared with my late husband for 26 years, and I have one son, my son, who is the best and most complicated thing that ever happened to me. His father passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 12 weeks from diagnosis to goodbye. My son flew home, held his father's hand, and then flew back to his life in Boston. I don't say that with bitterness. He had a life to get back to. I understood. I still understand. What I didn't fully understand, until recently, was how invisible I had become in that life. After my husband died, I retired from the federal bench. 31 years as a United States District Court judge. I had been appointed when my son was in middle school, and I had served through administrations and recessions and a pandemic. I had written opinions on constitutional law, civil rights, antitrust cases, and environmental litigation that were still being cited by attorneys across the country. My clerks had gone on to become judges themselves, law school professors, partners at prestigious firms. I had been recognized by the American Bar Association. I had given commencement addresses. But I was also tired and lonely, and when I retired, I discovered that without the robe, without the bench, I was just a widow living in a house that was too quiet. I tried to fill the space. I joined a book club. I volunteered at the public library. I took a watercolor class that I was absolutely terrible at. I called my son every Sunday. Sometimes he answered. My son, I'll call him by his middle name, which is what I called him at home, had married 3 years after his father died. I had met my daughter-in-law twice before the wedding, once for dinner in Boston, once at the rehearsal. She was polished and sharp and spoke in the quick, confident cadences of someone who had never once doubted she was the smartest person in any room she entered. She was a litigation attorney at one of Boston's oldest law firms. She had made junior partner at 34, which by any measure was a remarkable achievement. I genuinely tried to like her. I want to be honest about that. I sent gifts. I remembered her birthday. When they visited for Thanksgiving the first year, I cooked everything from scratch, her dietary restrictions included, which I had researched carefully. I asked about her cases. I asked about her colleagues. I asked about the apartment they were renovating. I tried. But my daughter-in-law had a way of looking at me that I recognized from the courtroom. It was the look attorneys gave witnesses they had already decided were not credible. Patient. Polite. Fundamentally uninterested. She would nod while I spoke and then redirect the conversation to something else within seconds. She never asked me a single question about my life. In 3 years, not one. My son noticed. Or if he noticed, he had decided that smoothing things over was easier than addressing them. He would change the subject when tension appeared. He would make a joke. He was, in this way, very much his father's son, a man who believed that most problems could be outlasted if you just stayed pleasant long enough. I had learned to accept a certain distance. It wasn't what I wanted, but I had made peace with it. I was not going to chase my daughter-in-law's approval. I was too old for that, and honestly, too proud. What I wanted was simply to be included, to feel like I mattered to the family my son was building. So when my daughter-in-law called me in October, she almost never called me. I was genuinely surprised. She was warm in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, but I decided not to read into it. She explained that my son's firm was hosting a dinner for a new corporate client, a significant relationship they had been building for months. Several partners from her law firm had been invited as well, since the companies had overlapping legal work. It was a formal dinner at a private dining room downtown. 12 people. She wanted to know if I would come. She framed it carefully. She said my son had mentioned wanting me there. She said it would mean a lot to him to have family present at an important professional milestone. She said she hoped we could spend more time together. I said yes, of course. I told her I would love to come. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long moment and felt something I hadn't felt in a while. I felt wanted. I should have paid more attention to that feeling. Not because it wasn't real, but because I should have asked myself more carefully why, after 3 years of distance, she suddenly wanted me at this particular dinner. I found out the answer fairly quickly once I arrived. The private dining room was on the 14th floor of a hotel downtown, all dark wood paneling and soft lighting and linen tablecloths. I arrived early, which is a habit from 30 years of running a courtroom on schedule. My son was there, and he hugged me warmly, genuinely. My daughter-in-law kissed my cheek and introduced me to 2 of her colleagues who were already at the bar. She introduced me as her mother-in-law. Just that. No additional context, no name, no background. The other guests arrived over the next 20 minutes. 2 senior partners from my daughter-in-law's firm, a man named Gerald who had the easy authority of someone who had been important for a long time, and a woman named Patricia who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and shook my hand with a firm, dry grip. There were executives from my son's company. There was a woman named Diane who was introduced as Gerald's wife. And then there was the client. His name was Robert Haverford. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the careful stillness of a man who measured everything before he spoke. He had built a regional healthcare company from the ground up over 30 years, and his firm was now navigating a significant merger that both my son's company and my daughter-in-law's law firm had interests in. He was, in the language of that room, the most important person at the table. He arrived with his own attorney, a quiet man named Thomas who carried a leather portfolio and said almost nothing all evening. We were seated. I was placed at the far end of the table, between Diane and Thomas. My daughter-in-law was near the center, between Gerald and Robert Haverford. My son was across from her. Dinner began. The conversation moved through the usual channels: markets, the city, a recent verdict in a high-profile case that several people at the table had followed. I listened more than I spoke. I had always been a good listener. It is, in many ways, the most important skill a judge can have. At some point during the second course, my daughter-in-law said something that caught my attention. Robert Haverford had asked her how she had come to specialize in healthcare litigation. She gave a polished answer about her early cases and her interest in regulatory law. And then, naturally, the conversation turned to background, to how people had arrived at this table. Gerald mentioned his years in D.C. Patricia talked about clerking for a circuit court judge early in her career. Robert Haverford mentioned that law had always fascinated him, even though he had gone into business instead. And then he looked down the table at me with the pleasant attention of a man who believed in including everyone in a conversation. He asked, genuinely, what I had done before I retired. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law spoke. She said, and I want to be precise about this because I have replayed it many times, she said, with a light laugh. Oh, she was a schoolteacher, for years and years. She's very proud of it. There was a brief pause at the table. Not long, just a beat. I looked at my son. He was looking down at his plate. Robert Haverford smiled politely at me and said, that was wonderful, that teachers were so important. I nodded and said thank you. The conversation moved on. My daughter-in-law did not look at me. She had already turned back to Gerald. I sat with that for a moment. A schoolteacher. She had told Robert Haverford and both senior partners of her firm, the people whose opinion of her mattered most in that room, that I was a retired schoolteacher. She had done it smoothly, efficiently, in a single sentence, before I could speak for myself. She had made me small and harmless and professionally irrelevant before I could say a single word. And my son had looked at his plate. I understood, in that moment, what the dinner invitation had actually been. I was set dressing. I was the warm, harmless, retired schoolteacher mother-in-law, present to humanize my daughter-in-law to an important client who, she had apparently determined, would respond well to the image of a woman who valued family. I was a prop. A pleasant, benign, easily dismissed prop. I thought about my watercolor class. I thought about my book club. I thought about Sunday evenings in a quiet house, waiting for a phone call that sometimes didn't come. And then I thought about 31 years behind a bench. I thought about the rulings I had written, the cases I had decided, the law I had shaped. I thought about the clerks who had told me I had changed the direction of their careers. I thought about the standing ovation at my retirement ceremony. I thought about the letter from the Chief Justice of the United States that was framed on the wall of my study at home. I decided to wait. Not because I was afraid, because I was curious to see how the evening would unfold, and because I had learned, over 3 decades on the bench, that the best moment to speak is rarely the first moment you want to. Dessert arrived. The conversation had moved to the merger itself, the legal complexities, the timeline. My daughter-in-law was in her element, precise, confident, clearly knowledgeable. She was genuinely impressive. I had always known that. I had just also always known that impressive and kind are not the same thing. It was Patricia who opened the door. Patricia, the senior partner with the reading glasses on the beaded chain, had been quiet for much of the dinner. She was the kind of person who listened carefully and spoke rarely, which made you pay attention when she did speak. She set down her dessert fork and looked at me with a directness that I found immediately familiar. It was the look of someone who had spent a career evaluating what people said versus what they actually knew. She said, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your full name earlier." I told her. There was a pause. Her expression shifted. It was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a recalibration, the particular look of someone rapidly reorganizing information they thought they had already processed. She said, slowly, were you on the federal bench? District court? I said I was. For 31 years. The table changed. I can only describe it that way. The texture of the room changed. Gerald looked up from his coffee. Robert Haverford turned toward me with his full attention for the first time all evening. Thomas, the quiet attorney with the portfolio, leaned slightly forward. Patricia said, "Judge, and used my last name. I cited your Meridian opinion in a brief I filed last spring. Your analysis of regulatory preemption in that case, we've used it in 3 separate filings this year alone." I said I remembered that case well. I said it had taken me a long time to write that opinion, that I had gone back and forth on the central question, and that I still believed I had come to the right conclusion, but that it had not been an easy road. Patricia laughed. It was a genuine laugh, warm and a little surprised. She said that was exactly what made the opinion so compelling, that the reasoning showed all the weight of the decision, that it didn't pretend the answer was obvious. Robert Haverford asked me about the case. I explained it in lay terms. A healthcare regulatory dispute, actually, relevant to the very industry he was in. His eyes were sharp and interested. He asked a follow-up question. I answered it. We talked for several minutes. He was genuinely engaged. Gerald asked which cases I was most proud of. I mentioned 2 or 3 briefly. Patricia and Gerald both knew them. They referenced clerks they had placed with my chambers. I mentioned 2 of those clerks by name and said what they had gone on to do. Gerald smiled and said he had followed one of them to a circuit appointment. I was not performing. I was not trying to impress anyone. I was simply answering questions honestly, the way I always had. But the effect of it, I noticed, was that the entire weight of the room had quietly redistributed. At some point, I became aware of my daughter-in-law's silence. She had not said a word in several minutes. She was holding her wine glass with both hands. Her face was composed, professionally controlled, the expression she would wear in a deposition when something unexpected had been introduced into the record. But I had spent 3 decades reading faces across a courtroom, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was working out what this meant. She was working out, specifically, what she had done and what it had been witnessed by. Gerald looked at her at one point and said, pleasantly, "You've been holding out on us. You didn't mention your mother-in-law was judge." My daughter-in-law smiled. She said she hadn't thought to bring it up. She said she didn't like to name-drop family. It was a graceful recovery. She was very good. I will always give her that. But Patricia was looking at her with the same careful, calibrating expression she had turned on me minutes earlier. And Robert Haverford had noticed the disconnect between what my daughter-in-law had said earlier and what was now sitting at the end of his table. My son was very quiet. He had barely spoken since Patricia said my name. I glanced at him once. He was looking at the tablecloth. His jaw was tight. He knew what he had allowed to happen, and he knew I knew it, and he knew there was nothing to do about it in that room. After dinner, while people were collecting coats and saying their goodbyes, Robert Haverford found me near the elevators. He shook my hand and held it for a moment. He said he had very much enjoyed speaking with me. He said he had a case moving through federal court right now, a different district, and that something I had said about regulatory analysis had given him a new way of thinking about it. He asked if I would be willing to have coffee sometime and continue the conversation. I said I would enjoy that very much. Patricia hugged me. Not a formal embrace, a real one. She said in my ear that it was a pleasure and that she hoped to see me again. My daughter-in-law stood near the coat check with a fixed smile. My son helped me into my coat. He walked me to the elevator. When the doors closed and it was just the two of us, he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the Sundays. I thought about the plate he had stared at. I thought about 31 years of decisions made carefully, with intention. I said, "I know you are." He said he didn't know she was going to do that. He said he would never have, and then he stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "I should have said something." At the table, "I should have said something." I said, "Yes, you should have." He looked at me the way he had looked at me when he was small and had done something he couldn't undo. He said, "Are you angry with me?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "I'm not angry, I'm disappointed, and I need you to understand that those are not the same thing, and that the second one matters more." He nodded. He looked like he might cry, and I decided that was probably appropriate. The elevator reached the lobby. I squeezed his arm before I stepped out. I told him to drive safe. I told him I loved him. Both of those things were true. They are always both true. That's what it means to be someone's mother. In the weeks that followed, things shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but they shifted. My daughter-in-law called me. Not immediately, it took her about 10 days. When she called, she was different, careful in a new way. She asked how I was doing. She asked about the library volunteer work. She asked, for the first time in 3 years, whether I had any upcoming travel plans. I answered her questions honestly and without warmth that I didn't genuinely feel. I was not cold. I was not punishing her. I was simply being exactly as present as I actually was. No more performance of enthusiasm, no working harder to bridge a distance she had created. She noticed. I could tell. And I think, in some way, she respected it. Robert Haverford and I did have coffee. He was thoughtful and curious and told me about a nonprofit board he was building, focused on healthcare access in underserved communities. He asked if I would consider serving. I told him I would think about it seriously. I have been thinking about it seriously. Patricia sent me a note, handwritten on firm letterhead, thanking me for a stimulating evening and including her direct line. She said she would love to have lunch sometime. We have since had lunch twice. She is sharp and funny and does not suffer fools, which I find enormously refreshing. My son calls every week now. Not sometimes. Every week. He doesn't always have much to say, and sometimes we just talk about small things, the weather, a book he's reading, something that happened at work. But he calls, and when I mention something I've been doing, something I care about, he asks follow-up questions. He listens. He is trying, and I am trying. And I think that is all you can ask of people who love each other imperfectly. My daughter-in-law and I are not close. I don't think we will be, not in the way I once quietly hoped. But we are honest with each other in a way we weren't before. We exist in each other's lives without pretense. She knows who I am now. Not because I told her I never sat her down and cataloged my accomplishments, but because she saw it the way it needed to be seen, in real time, witnessed by people whose opinion she valued, without any editing she could control. That's not a victory. I don't want to frame it that way. I didn't sit through that dinner calculating a revenge. I sat through it because I had been invited, and because some part of me still wanted to believe the invitation was genuine, and because even after years of disappointment, I wasn't willing to be the one who stopped trying. What I did was simply refuse to make myself smaller than I am. I didn't wave my history around. I didn't correct my daughter-in-law in front of the table. I answered a direct question directly when Patricia asked it, and I let the truth do what the truth does when it finally gets a little room. I think about what I would tell a younger woman going through something like this, and I think I would tell her, do not shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. Do not let the people who love you imperfectly convince you that the imperfection is yours to carry. Hold your ground, not with anger, not with performance, but simply by refusing to disappear. You have lived a life. You have a history. You have done things that mattered. The fact that someone in your family hasn't bothered to ask about them does not make them less real. It makes their ignorance their problem. And sometimes, in a 14th floor dining room with linen tablecloths and the right question from the right person, the truth comes out quietly on its own. I drove home that night through the dark streets of the city I had served for 3 decades. I passed the federal courthouse where I had spent 31 years. I have driven past it hundreds of times since I retired, and sometimes I feel wistful, the way you do about anything you built your identity inside of. But that night I didn't feel wistful. I felt I kept searching for the word, and the one I came back to was whole. I felt whole. When I got home, I made a cup of tea. I sat in the chair by the window, the one my husband always used, and I thought about the evening. I thought about Patricia's hug. I thought about Robert Haverford shaking my hand and asking if we could continue the conversation. I thought about my son in the elevator, saying he was sorry. I thought about my daughter-in-law at the coat check with her fixed smile, and I thought not unkindly that I hoped she had learned something, not about me, about herself, about what it costs to dismiss people before you know them, about the specific kind of loneliness that comes from building your identity on being the most impressive person in the room, and then discovering the room has more people in it than you thought. I don't know if she learned it. That's not mine to know. What I know is this. I am 67 years old. I have raised a son. I have buried a husband. I have sat behind a federal bench and made decisions that outlasted me. I have been lonely in a quiet house, and I have kept going. I have learned more than I can count, and I am still learning, and I will keep going until I can't anymore. I am not a decoration at someone else's table. I am not a prop to make someone else look warmer. I am not a retired schoolteacher with nothing left to offer. I am exactly who I have always been. I just had to wait for the right question. If you are somewhere in your life feeling like the room has already decided who you are, if the people around you have written your story before you had a chance to speak, I want you to hear this. Let them be surprised. Hold what you know about yourself quietly and carefully, the way you hold anything that matters. Your life is not diminished by the fact that someone didn't think to ask about it. Wait. Answer honestly when the question comes. And let the truth speak for itself. It always does, in the end.